August 15th, 1945. Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan. The first time most subjects had ever heard their living god speak, his words, coded in formal court language, were almost incomprehensible, but the meaning slowly sank in. Surrender. In Tokyo, people wept. On battleships, officers committed seppuku. And on a jungle-covered island called Lubang in the Philippines, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda listened to the broadcast on a stolen radio. He was 23 years old. He commanded 3 men, and he made a decision that would define the next 29 years of his life. The war wasn't over. It was a trick. Don't forget to subscribe to World War II Untold Stories and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. To understand why Onoda couldn't surrender, why the concept was literally impossible in his mind, you have to understand Bushido, not the romanticized version, the real code that shaped Japanese military culture and turned men into weapons that couldn't be disarmed. Bushido means the way of the warrior. Its roots stretched back to medieval samurai, but by World War II, it had been weaponized by the military into something far more absolute. Death before dishonor wasn't a preference. It was the only acceptable choice. Japanese soldiers received training that Western forces found incomprehensible. From the first day of basic training, recruits learned that surrender equaled shame so profound it destroyed not just the individual, but his entire family. Parents would be ostracized. Siblings couldn't marry. The family name would be destroyed for generations. Officers told recruits that Americans tortured and murdered prisoners. That surrender meant castration, slow death, humiliation. Better to die fighting. Better to die by your own hand. Better to die anyway except as a prisoner. The Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, issued in 1882 and memorized by every Japanese serviceman, contained one crucial line: "Duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather." Translation: your obligation to the Emperor outweighs your life by an infinite margin. This wasn't just propaganda. This was core cultural programming that reached back centuries. The 47 Ronin, the samurai who chose death over dishonor. These weren't cautionary tales in Japanese culture. They were ideals. Onoda had received special training. He was an intelligence officer, trained in guerrilla warfare and survival by the Nakano School, Japan's equivalent of special operations. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had given him explicit orders before the Allied invasion. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. When the Emperor's surrender broadcast reached Lubang Island, Onoda had 4 men under his command: Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. The youngest was 20, the oldest 26. They had a decision to make. In the jungle that night, according to Onoda's later account, they discussed what the broadcast meant. The Emperor's voice had been unclear, the language formal and confusing. And the Americans were known for psychological warfare. Onoda made his assessment. This was enemy propaganda, a trick to make Japanese forces surrender before the final decisive battle. His orders were clear: stay, fight, wait for the counterattack that would surely come. The other 3 men accepted his analysis. They were Japanese soldiers. Their lieutenant had given an order, And in their culture, in their training, in everything they'd been taught since childhood, surrender wasn't an option that existed. But here's what makes this story more than just stubborn soldiers. American forces on Lubang knew Japanese troops were still hiding in the jungle. Within weeks of the surrender, they began dropping leaflets, messages in Japanese. The war is over. Emperor Hirohito has ordered all forces to surrender. You will be treated well. Your families are waiting. Onoda and his men found the leaflets, read them carefully, and concluded they were fake. The Japanese was too perfect, obviously written by a propaganda unit, the paper quality too good, and the core message was impossible. A Japanese soldier's family wouldn't be waiting for a man who surrendered. They would be in mourning for their shame. The cultural gap was absolute. Americans thought, give them the facts, and they'll make the rational choice. Japanese soldiers thought, they're trying to trick us into the one thing worse than death. For the next 29 years, Onoda and his men would live in the jungle, stealing food from villagers, burning rice stores they believed were feeding enemy forces, shooting at Philippine police who tried to approach them. They saw themselves as soldiers behind enemy lines. The Philippines saw them as dangerous holdouts. Both were right. The jungle of Lubang Island became their entire world. They built camps deep in the interior, where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. They survived on stolen rice, bananas, coconuts, and the occasional water buffalo they could kill and dry. Every few months, leaflets would fall from the sky, sometimes dropped by American planes, later by Japanese self-defense force aircraft. Family letters, newspaper clippings about Japan's reconstruction, photos of Tokyo's new buildings, copies of the surrender document, with Emperor Hirohito's seal clearly visible. Onoda examined each leaflet with an intelligence officer's eye. The seal looked real, but seals could be forged. The family letters mentioned details only relatives would know, but prisoners could be tortured for information. The photos of modern Japan looked too prosperous, obviously propaganda showing how well Japan would do under American occupation if they surrendered. His training had taught him to trust nothing from the enemy. Every instinct, every lesson, every cultural value he held told him the same thing. This was psychological warfare, sophisticated, almost convincing, but warfare nonetheless. In 1949, one of his men broke. Private Yuichi Akatsu couldn't take it anymore. 28 years old, and he'd spent the last 4 years in the jungle. He slipped away one night and surrendered to Philippine forces. When news reached the others, they didn't feel relief or hope. They felt betrayal. Akatsu had chosen shame over duty, but his surrender had an unexpected effect. It made the remaining 3 even more determined. If the war was really over, why was Akatsu denounced in the leaflets that followed? The new propaganda called him a traitor, claimed his family had disowned him. To Onoda, this proved everything. No Japanese family would disown a son who'd followed the emperor's legitimate orders to surrender. Therefore, the surrender must be fake. The logic was circular, but unbreakable. Years passed. Corporal Shimada was shot and killed by a Philippine search party in 1954. The searchers had called out in Japanese, offering food and safety. Shimada opened fire. He died believing he was defending his position against an enemy trick. Now there were 2, Onoda and Kozuka. They maintained military discipline. Daily inspections of their rifles kept in perfect condition despite the humidity. regular patrols of their territory. Attack plans for the counteroffensive that must be coming. They watched the island change. Electricity came to the villages, then television antennas, roads improved. They saw what looked like prosperity, peace, development. Onoda's explanation: the Americans had achieved total control. This is what occupation looked like when resistance had been crushed everywhere else. They were the last soldiers fighting. The isolation was absolute. They spoke to no one except each other for years at a time. Kozuka mentioned once that he barely remembered what his mother's face looked like. 20 years in the jungle. He'd been 19 when the war ended. In October 1972, Kozuka was killed. He and Onoda were burning rice in a storage building. What they believed was denying resources to enemy forces. Philippine police opened fire. Kozuka fell. Onoda escaped into the jungle. For the first time in 27 years, Hiroo Onoda was alone. He was 50 years old. He'd spent more than half his life in the jungle of Lubang, and he was still waiting for orders. The Japanese government intensified efforts to find him. Search parties combed the jungle. Loudspeakers played messages from his family. His brothers came to the island and walked through the jungle, calling his name. Onoda heard them, watched from concealment, and concluded this was the cruelest psychological warfare yet, using voices that sounded exactly like his family. Then, in February 1974, something impossible happened. A young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki appeared in Onoda's camp. He was a college dropout, 24 years old, who'd come to the Philippines looking for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Suzuki had simply walked into the jungle with a camera and camping gear. No weapons, no soldiers, just a young man who wanted to meet the legendary Holdout. When he encountered Onoda on a trail, he bowed and introduced himself. According to Suzuki's account, he said, "Lieutenant Onoda, I am Japanese. The war has been over for almost 30 years. Onoda didn't shoot him." Later, he would say he didn't know why. Maybe because Suzuki was so obviously not a soldier. Maybe because something in Suzuki's voice, the modern accent, the casual manner, was too authentic to be propaganda. They talked for 4 days. Onoda explained his orders, explained why he couldn't surrender without explicit commands from his superior officer. Explained the entire logic that had sustained him for 29 years. Suzuki listened without judgment. Then he said, "If I bring your commanding officer to give you orders, will you surrender?" Onoda said yes. Suzuki returned to Japan. Against all odds, he located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the officer who'd given Onoda his final orders in 1944. Taniguchi was now 69 years old, running a small bookstore. He'd long since assumed Onoda was dead. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi flew to Lubang Island. Philippine officials agreed to allow the meeting. Taniguchi, in civilian clothes, but carrying his old military sword as proof of identity, walked into a designated clearing. Onoda appeared from the jungle. He wore a tattered uniform he'd maintained for 29 years. His rifle was clean, functional, and loaded. He still had 500 rounds of ammunition. He saluted. Taniguchi returned the salute. Then Taniguchi gave the order Onoda had been waiting almost 3 decades to hear. "Lieutenant Onoda, by order of the Emperor, the war is over. You are relieved of duty. Surrender your weapon and return home." Onoda saluted again, formally presented his rifle, and finally, allowed himself to accept what part of him had probably known for years. The war was over. Japan had lost. The Emperor had surrendered, and he had spent 29 years fighting a war that had ended in 1945. The Philippine government pardoned him for the killing of 30 civilians and police during his time in the jungle. Japan welcomed him home as a hero, a soldier who'd kept faith to the absolute end. The global media couldn't decide if he was the most dedicated soldier in history or a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute obedience. Onoda himself struggled with the answer. In his memoir, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, he wrote about the crushing realization that every bullet he'd fired after August 1945 had been meaningless. Every year in the jungle had been unnecessary. Shimada and Kozuka had died for nothing. But he couldn't quite call it nothing. He'd followed his orders. He'd maintained his honor. In the moral framework of Bushido, the code that had shaped his entire existence, he'd done exactly what a Japanese soldier was supposed to do. The tragedy wasn't just Onoda. Estimates suggest around 100 Japanese soldiers scattered across Pacific Islands refused to surrender after the war ended. Some held out for years. Some died still fighting. Some, like Onoda, eventually came home to a world that had moved on without them. Their story reveals the most fundamental clash of the Pacific War, Western pragmatism versus Eastern honor culture. Americans saw survival as logical, surrender as sensible when defeated. Japanese soldiers saw surrender as worse than death, not metaphorically, but literally. Neither side could comprehend the other's worldview. That incomprehension killed thousands in battles where surrender might have saved lives. It kept men in the jungle for decades after peace had come. It made the Pacific War more brutal, more absolute, more total than the European theater. When Onoda finally returned to Japan in 1974, he found a country he didn't recognize. The Japan he'd fought for, emperor worship, military supremacy, divine destiny, was gone. In its place was a prosperous democracy. His family had mourned him for 29 years and moved on with their lives. His brothers had successful careers. Japan had rebuilt, thrived, and transformed into an economic powerhouse. He'd preserved his honor, but he'd lost everything else. Onoda spent his later years working with youth, teaching survival skills, running a nature school in Brazil. He died in 2014 at age 91. Until the end, he maintained he'd done his duty, that honor demanded what he gave, that his choices, given his orders and his culture, were the only ones he could have made. Whether that's tragic or admirable depends on your worldview. It's the question the Pacific War asked and never answered. What happens when duty and reason point in opposite directions? When honor demands the impossible? When cultural values make survival itself a form of defeat? For 29 years, Hiroo Onoda chose honor over everything. He kept faith with a code that most of the world, including modern Japan, had left behind. His story is a monument to dedication, and a warning about the cost of values taken to their absolute extreme. The jungle of Lubang Island is quiet now. The Philippines has moved on. The places where Onoda and his men fought their private war are overgrown, unmarked, forgotten by everyone except historians and the families who lost loved ones. But the question remains, when two worldviews collide so completely that surrender becomes impossible to conceive, when cultural programming runs so deep that rational choice disappears, how do wars ever end? How do enemies ever stop fighting when their entire identity depends on never stopping? Onoda's war ended only because one young college dropout didn't see a dangerous holdout. He saw a man trapped by orders he couldn't disobey and brought him the one person who could set him free. Sometimes peace requires not just victory, but understanding deep enough to bridge the unbridgeable gap. If you enjoyed this story from World War II, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to World War II Untold Stories for more untold stories from history's greatest conflict. Thank you for watching.